Theme 9: The Industrial Revolution. The transformation of industry and the economy in Britain between the 1780s and the 1850s is called the First Industrial Revolution. This had far-reaching effects in Britain. Later similar changes occurred in European countries and in the USA. These were to have a major impact on the society and economy of those countries and also on the rest of the world. This phase of industrial development in Britain is strongly associated with new machinery and technologies. This made it possible to produce goods on a massive scale compared to handicraft and handloom industries. The chapter outlines the changes in the cotton and iron industries. Steam, a new source of power, began to be used on a wide scale in British industries. Its use led to faster forms of transportation by ships and railways. Many of the inventors and businessmen who brought about these changes were often neither personally wealthy nor educated in basic sciences like physics or chemistry, as will be seen from glances into the backgrounds of some of them. Industrializations into led to greater prosperity for some, but in the initial stages it was linked to poor living and working conditions of millions of people, including women and children. They sparked off protest which forced the government to enact laws for regulating conditions of work. In the second one, after about 1850, new areas like the chemical and electrical industries expanded. In that period, Britain fell behind and lost its position as the world's leading industrial power as it was overtaken by Germany and the USA. The term Industrial Revolution was used by European scholars George Michelet in France and Friedrich Engels in Germany. It was used for the first time in English by the philosopher and economist Arnold Toynbee to describe the changes that occurred in British industrial development between 1760 and 1820. These dates coincide with those of reign of George III, on which Toynbee was giving a series of lectures at Oxford University. His lectures was published in 1884 after his untimely death as a book called Lectures on the Industrial Revolution in England, popular addresses, notes, and other fragments. Later historians T.S. Aston, Paul Mantoux, and Eric Hobsbawm broadly agreed with Toynbee. There was remarkable economic growth from the 1780s to 1820 in the cotton and iron industries, in coal mining, in the building of roads and canals, and in foreign trade. Aston 1889-1968 celebrated the Industrial Revolution when England was swept by a wave of gadget. Why Britain? Britain was the first country to experience modern industrialization. It had been politically stable since the 17th century, with England, Wales, and Scotland unified under the monarchy. This meant that the kingdom had common laws, a single currency, and a market that was not fragmented by local authorities levying taxes on goods that passed through their area, thus increasing their price. By the end of 17th century, money was widely used as a medium of exchange. By then, a large section of the people received their income in the form of wages and salaries rather than in goods. This gave people a wider choice for ways to spend their earnings and expanded the market for the sale of goods. In 18th century, England had been through a major economic change, later described as the agricultural revolution. This was the process by which bigger landlords had bought up small farms near their own properties and enclosed the village common lands, thus creating very large estate and increasing food production. This forced landless farmers and those who had lived by grazing animals on the common lands to search for jobs elsewhere. Most of them went to nearby towns. The man of wealth and pride takes up a space that many poor supplied space for his lake. His parks extended bound space for his horses, equipage and hounds. The robe that wraps his limbs in silken sloth has robbed the neighboring fields of half their growth. Oliver Goldsmith, 1728 to 74, The Deserted Village, Town, Trade and Finance. From the 18th century, many towns in Europe were growing in area and population out of the 19 European cities whose population doubled between 1750 and 1811 were in Britain. The largest of them was London, which served as the thumb of country's market, with the next largest ones located close to it. London had also acquired a global significance by the 18th century, the center of global trade, and shifted from the Mediterranean ports of Italy and France to the Atlantic ports of Holland and Britain. Still later, London replaced Amsterdam as the principal source of loans for international trade. London also became the center of a triangular trade network that drew in England, Africa, and the West Indies. The companies trading in America and Asia also had their offices in London. In England, the movement of goods between markets was helped by a good network of rivers and an indented coastline with shelters bays. Until the speed of railways, transport by waterways was cheaper and faster than by lines. As early as 1724, English rivers provided some 1,160 miles of navigable water, and except of mountainous area, most places in the country were within 15 miles of a river, since all the navigate sections of English river flows into the sea. Cargo on river vessels was easily transferred to coastal ships called coasters. By 1800, at least 1 lakh sailors worked on the coasters. Activity 1 discuss the development in Britain and in other parts of the world in the 18th century that encouraged British industrialization. Comment this. The center of the country's financial system was the Bank of England, founded in 1694. By 1784, there were more than 100 provincial banks in England, and during the next 10 years, their numbers trebled. By the 1820s, there were more than 600 banks in the provinces and over 100 banks in London alone. The financial requirement to establish and maintain big industrial enterprises were met by these banks. The industrialization that occurred in Britain from the 1780s to the 1850s is explained partly by the factor described above. Many poor people from the village available to work in town, banks which could loan money to set up large industries, and a good transport network. The following pages will describe two new factors: a range of technological changes that increase production levels dramatically, and a new transport network created by the construction of railways. In both developments, if the dates are read carefully, one will notice that there is a gap of a few decades between the development and its widespread application. One must not assume that a new innovation in technology led to it being used in the industry immediately. Of the 26,000 inventions recorded in the 18th century, more than half were listed for the period 1782 to 1800. This led to many changes. We shall discuss the four major ones: the transformations of the iron industries, the spinning and weaving of cotton, the development of steam power, and the coming of the railways. Coal and iron. England was fortunate in the coal and iron war. The staple materials for mechanizations were plentiful available, as were other minerals, lead, copper, and tin that were used in industry. However, until the 18th century, there was a scarcity of usable iron. Iron is drawn out from ore as pure liquid metal by a process called smelting. For centuries, charcoal from burnt timber was used for the smelting process. This had several problems. Charcoal was too fragile to transport across long distance. Its impurities produced poor quality iron. It was in short supply because coal broke down, blast furnaces left and center, and charcoal ovens right. Painting by F. Weber, 1758. Forest had been destroyed for timber and it could not generate high temperature. The solution to this problem had been sought for years before it was solved by a family of iron masters, the Derbys of Shropshire. In the course of half a century, three generations of this family, grandfather, father, and son, all called Abraham Derby, brought about a revolution in the metallurgical industry. It began with an invention in 1709 by the first Abraham Derby, 1677 to 1717. This was a blast furnace that would use coke, which could generate high temperature. Coke was derived from coal by removing the sulfur and impurities. This invention meant that furnaces no longer had to depend on charcoal. The melted iron that emerged from these furnaces permitted finer and larger casting than before. The cast iron bridge near Coalbrookdale, painting by William Williams, 1780. This area later grew into a village called Iron Bridge. The process was further refined by more invention. The second Derby, 1711 to 68, developed wrought iron, which was less brittle from pig iron. Henry Court, 1740 to 1823, designed the puddling furnace in which molten iron could be rid of impurities, and rolling mill, which used steam power to roll purified iron into bars. It now became possible to produce a broader range of iron products. The durability of iron made it a better material than wood for everyday items and for machinery. Unlike wood, which could burn or splinter, the physical and chemical properties of iron could be controlled. In the 1770s, John Wilkinson, 1728 to 1808, made the first iron chairs, vats for breweries and distilleries, and iron pipes of all sizes. In 1779, the third Derby, 1750 to 91, built the first iron bridge in the world in Coalbrookdale, spanning the river Severn. Wilkinson used cast iron for the first time to make water pipes, 40 miles of it for the water supply of Paris. Britain mapped the iron industry. Scotland, iron and coal manufacturing area. Newcastle, North Sea, Yorkshire, Lancashire, Irish, Leeds, Manchester, Liverpool, Sheffield, Birmingham, Shropshire, Wales, England, Bristol Channel, Bristol, Swansea, London, Cornwall, English Channel, France. The iron industry then came to be concentrated in specific regions as integrated units of coal mining and iron smelting. Britain was lucky in processing excellent coking coal and high-grade iron ore in the same basins or even the same seams. These basins were also close to ports. There were five coastal coalfields which could deliver their products almost straight into ships. Since the coalfields were near the coast, shipbuilding increased, as did the shipping trade. Activity 2 Iron Beach, George stood a major heritage site. Can you suggest why? Comment this. The British iron industry quadrupled its output between 1800 and 1830, and its product was the cheapest in Europe. In 1820, a ton of pig iron needed 8 tons of coal to make it, but by 1850 it could be produced by using only 2 tons. By 1848, Britain was melting more iron than the rest of the world put together. Cotton spinning and weaving. The British had always woven clothes out of wool and flax to make linen. From the 17th century, the country had been importing bales of cotton cloth from India at great cost. As the East India Company's political control of parts of India was established, it began to import all the with cloth raw cotton, which could be spun and woven into cloth in England. Till the early 18th century, spinning had been so slow and laborious that 10 spinners, mostly women, hence the word spinster, were required to supply sufficient yarn to keep a single weaver busy. Therefore, while spinners were occupied all day, weavers waited idly to receive yarn, but a series of technological inventions successfully closed the gap between the speed in spinning raw cotton into yarn or thread and of weaving the yarn into fabric. To make it even more efficient, production gradually shifted from the homes of spinners and weavers to factories. From the 1780s, the cotton industry symbolized British industrialization. In many ways, this industry had two features which were also seen in other industries. Raw cotton had to be entirely imported, and a large part of the finished cloth was exported. They sustained the process of colonization. Manpower in this picture, Oman power. Worked the treadmill that lowered the lid of the cotton press. Won the flying shuttle loom designed by John Kay. 1704 in 1733 made it possible to weave broader fabrics in less time and consequently called for more yarn than could be supplied at the prevailing pace of spinning. 2. The spinning jenny was a machine made by James Hargreaves. 1720 to 78 in 1765. On which a single person could spin several threads of yarn simultaneously. This provides weaver with yarn at a faster rate than they could weave into fabric. 3. The water frame, which recurs outright 1732 to 92, invented in 1769, produced a much stronger thread than before. This also made it possible to weave pure cotton fabrics rather than fabrics that combine linen and cotton yarn. For the mule was the nickname for a machine invented in 1779 by Samuel Crompton, 1753 to 1827, that allowed the spinning of strong and fine yarn. 5. The secular inventions in the cotton textile industry that sought to maintain a balance between the tasks of spinning and weaving concluded with the invention of the power loom by Edmund Cartwright. 1743 to 1823. In 1787, this was easy to work, stopped automatically every time a thread broke, and could be used to weave any kind of material. From the 1830s, developments in this industry concentrated on increasing the productivity of workers rather than bringing new machines into use. Britain, the cotton industry. Scotland, cotton textile manufacturing areas, Glasgow, Newcastle, North Sea, Yorkshire, Lancashire, Ayrshire, Leeds, Manchester, Nottingham, Leicester, Birmingham, England, Wales, English Channel, London, France, Bristol Channel. So that Britain could retain control over the sources of raw cottons as well as the market. The industry was heavily dependent on the work of women and children in factories. This exemplified the ugly face of early industrialization as will be described below. Steam power. The realization that steam could generate tremendous power was decisive to large-scale industrializations. Water as hydraulic power had been the prime source of energy for centuries, but it had been limited to certain areas, seasons, and by the speed of the flow of water. Now it was used differently. Steam power provided pressure at high temperatures that enabled the use of a broad range of machinery. This meant that steam power was the only source of energy that was reliable and inexpensive enough to manufacture machinery itself. Steam power was first used in mining industries as the demand for coal and metals expanded. Efforts to obtain them from ever deeper mines intensified. Flooding in mines was a serious problem. Thomas Savery, 1650 to 1715, built a modern steam engine called the Miner's Friend in 1698 to drain mines. These engines worked slowly in shallow depth and the boiler burst under too much pressure. Ward's inventions were not limited to the steam engine. He invented a chemical process for copying documents. He also created a unit of measurement based on comparing mechanical power with that of the previous universal power of source, the horse. Watt's measurement unit horsepower equated the ability of a horse to lift 33,000 pounds, 14,969 kg, 1 foot, 0.3 m. In 1 minute. Horsepower remains as a universally used index of mechanical energy. Horses turn the wheels to grind metal. The use of steam reduced the dependence on manpower and horsepower. Another steam engine was built by Thomas Newcomen, 1663 to 1729. In 1712, this had the major defect of losing energy due to continuous cooling of the condensing cylinder. The steam engine had been used only in coal mines until James Watt, 1736 to 1819, developed his machine in 1769. Watt's invention converted the steam engine from being a mere pump into a prime mover capable of providing energy to power machines in factories. backed by the wealthy manufacturer Matthew Boulton. 1728 to 1809, what created the Soho Foundry in Birmingham in 1775. From the foundry, what steam engines were produced in steadily growing numbers. By the end of the 18th century, what steam engine was beginning to replace hydraulic power. After 1800, steam engine technology was further developed with the use of lighter, stronger metal, the manufacture of more accurate machine tools, and spread of better scientific knowledge. In 1840, British steam engines were generating more than 70% of all European horsepower. Canals and railways. Canals were initially built to transport coal to cities. This was because the bulk and weight of coal made its transport by road much slower and more expensive than by large-owned canals. The demand for coal and industrial energy and for heating and lighting homes in cities grew constantly. The making of the first English canal, the Worsley Canal, 1761 by James Brindley, 1716 to 72, had no other purpose than to carry coal from the coal deposit at Worsley near Manchester to the city. After the canal was completed, the price of coal fell by half. Canals were usually built by big landowners to increase the value of the mines, quarries, or forest on their lands. The confluence of canals created marketing centers in new towns. The city of Birmingham, for example, owed its growth to its position at the heart of a canal system connecting London, the Bristol Channel, and the Mersey and Humber rivers. From 1760 to 1790, 25 new canal building projects were began in the period known as the Canal Mania. From 1788 to 1796, there were another 46 new projects, and over the next 60 years, more than 4,000 miles of canals were built. The first steam locomotive, Stephenson's rocket, appeared in 1814. Railways emerged as a new means of transportation that was available throughout the year, both cheap and fast to carry passengers and goods. They combined two inventions, the iron track, which replaced the wooden track in the 1760s, and haulage along it by steam engine. The invention of the railway took the entire process of industrialization to a second stage in 1801. Richard Trevithick, 1771 to 1833, had devised an engine called the Puffing Devil that pulled trucks around the mine where they worked in Cornwall. In 1814, the railway engineer George Stephenson, 1781 to 1848, constructed a locomotive called the Blacher that could pull a weight of 30 tons up a hill at 4 miles per hour. The first railway that connected the cities of Stockton and Darlington in 1825, a distance of 9 miles that was completed in 2 hours at speed of up to 24 kilometers per hour, 15 miles per hour, and the next railway line connected Liverpool and Manchester in 1830. Within 20 years, speeds of 30 to 50 miles an hour were usual. In the 1830s, the use of canals revealed several problems. The congestion of vessels made movement slow on certain stretches of canal, and frost, flood, or drought limited the time of their use. The railways now appeared as a convenient alternative. About 6,000 miles of railway was opened in Britain between 1830 and 1850, most of it in two short bursts. During the Little Railway Mania of 1833 to 37, 1,400 miles of line was built, and during the Bigger Mania of 1844 to 47, another 9,500 miles of lines was sanctioned. They used vast amounts of coal and irons, employed large numbers of workers, and boosted activity in the construction and public works industry. Most of England had been connected by railway by 1850. Who were the inventors? It is interesting to find out who the individuals were who brought about these changes. Few of them were trained scientists. Education in basic sciences like physics or chemistry was extremely limited until the late 19th century. Well after the technological invention described above, since these breakthroughs did not require a full knowledge of the laws of physics or chemistry on which they were best advanced could be, and were made by brilliant but intuitive thinkers and persistent experiments. They were helped by the fact that England had certain features which European countries did not. Dozens of scientific journals and published papers of scientific societies appeared in England between 1762 and 1800. There was a widespread thirst for knowledge. Even in the smaller town, this was met by the activities of the Society of Arts, founded in 1754 by traveling lecturers or in coffee houses that multiplied through the 18th century. Most inventions were more the product of determination, interest, curiosity, even luck than the application of scientific knowledge. Some inventors in the cotton industry, like John Kay and James Hargreaves, were familiar with the skills of weaving and carpentry. Richard Arkwright, however, was a barber and wig maker. Samuel Crompton was not technically skilled, and Edmund Cartwright studied literature, medicine, and agriculture. Initially, wished to become a clergyman, and knew little of mechanics. By contrast, in the area of steam engine, Thomas Savery and army officer Thomas Newcomen, a blacksmith and locksmith, and James Watt with a strong mechanical bent all had some knowledge relevant to their invention. The road builder John Metcalfe, who personally surveyed surfaces for roads and planned them, was blind. The canal builder James Brindley was almost illiterate, with such poor spelling that he could never spell the word navigation, but he had tremendous power of memory, imagination, and concentration. Changed lives. In these years, therefore, it was possible for individuals with talent to bring about revolutionary changes. Similarly, there were rich individuals who took risks and invested money in industries in the hope that profits could be made and that their money would multiply. In most cases, this money capital did multiply wealth in the form of goods, incomes, service, knowledge, and productive efficiency. They did increase dramatically. There was at the same time the massive negative human cost. This was evident in broken families, new addresses, degraded cities, and appalling working conditions in factors. The number of cities in England with a population of over 50,000 grew from 2 in 1750 to 29 in 1850. This pace of growth was not matched with the provision of adequate housing, sanitation, or clean water for the rapidly growing urban population. Far left, Cole Brookdale, Carpenter's Row, cottage built by the company for workers in 1783, left Houses of the Derbys, painting by William Westwood, 1835. Newcomers were forced to live in overcrowded slums in the congested central areas of towns near factories, while the rich inhabitants escaped by shifting to homes in the suburb where the air was cleaner and the water safe to drink. The Gates of Hell. Edward Carpenter eloquently describes such cities in about 1881 in his poem In a Manufacturing Town. As we walked restless and despondent through the gloomy city and saw the eager unresting to and fro as of ghosts in some sulphurous herds, and saw the crowds of tall chimney going up and pall of smoke covering the sun, covering the earth, lying heavy against the very ground, and saw the huge refuse heap wreathing with children picking them over, and the ghastly half-roofless smoke-blackened house and the black river flowing below. As I saw this, as I saw again far away the capitalist quarter, with its villa residence and its high walled garden and its well-appointed carriage, and its face turned away from the wriggling poverty which made it rich, I shuddered. The Workers, a survey in 1842 revealed that the average lifespan of workers was lower than that of any other social groups in cities. It was 15 years of Birmingham, 17 in Manchester, 21 in Derby. More people died at a younger age in the new industrial cities than in the villages they had come from. Half the children failed to survive beyond the age of 5. The increase in the population of cities was because of immigration rather than by an increase in the number of children born to families who already lived there. Deaths were primarily caused by epidemics of disease that sprang from the pollution of water, like cholera and typhoid, or of the air, like tuberculosis. More than 31,000 people died from an outbreak of cholera in 1832. Until late in the 19th century, municipal authorities was negligent in attending to this dangerous condition of life, and the medical knowledge to understand and cure this disease was unknown. Women, children, and industrializations. The Industrial Revolution was a time of important changes in the way that children and women worked. Children of the rural poor had always worked at home or in the farm at jobs that varied during the day or between sessions. Under the watchful eye of parents or relatives, likewise in village, women were actively involved in farm work. They reared livestock, gathered firewood, spun yarn on spinning wheels in their homes, work in the factories with long unbroken hours of the same kind of work under strict discipline and sharp form of punishment was completely different. The earning of women and children were necessary to supplement men's meagre wages. As the use of machinery spread and fewer workers were needed, industrialists preferred to employ women and children who would be less agitated about the poor working condition and work for lower wages than men. They were employed in large numbers in the cotton textile industry in Lancashire and Warwickshire. Women were also the main workers in the silk. Women in Guildbutton factory, Birmingham in the 1850s. Two-thirds of the workforce in the Burton trade were women and children. Men received 25 shillings a week, women 7 shillings, and children 1 shillings each for the same hour of work. Lace making and knitting industry as well as along with children in the metal industries of Birmingham, machinery like the cotton spinning jenny was designed to be used by child workers with their small build and nimble fingers. Children were often employed in textile factories because they were small enough to move between tightly packed machinery. The long hours of work, including cleaning the machine on Sunday, allowed them little fresh air or exercise. Children caught their hair in machines or crushed their hands, while some died when they fell into machines as they dropped off to sleep from exhaustion. Coal mines were also dangerous places to work in. Roofs caved in or there could be an explosions, and injuries were therefore common. The owners of coal mines used children to reach deep coal faces or those where the approach path was too narrow for adults. Younger children worked as trappers who opened and shut doors as the coal wagon traveled through mines or carried heavy loads of coal on their backs as coal bearers. A lane in the poorer quarters of London, engraving by the French artist Dur, 1876, Factory managers considered child labor to be important training for future factory work. The evidence from British factory records reveals that about half of the factory workers had started to work then when they were less than 10 years old and 28% when they were under 14. Women may well have gained increased financial independence and self-esteem from their jobs, but this was more than offset by the humiliating terms of work they endured. The children that lost at birth or in early childhood and the squalid urban slums that industrial work compelled them to live in. In the novel Hard Times, Charles Dickens (1812 to 70), one of the most severe contemporary critics of the horror of industrialization for the poor, wrote a fictional account of an industrial town he aptly called Cooktown. It was a town of red brick, or a brick that would have been red if the smoke and ashes had allowed it. But as matters stood, it was a town of unnatural red and black like the painted face of a savage. It was a town of machinery and tall chimney out of which interminable serpents of smoke trailed themselves for ever and never got uncoiled. It had a black canal in it and a river that ran purple with ill-smelling dye, and vast piles of building full of windows where there was a rattling and trembling all along, and where the piston of the steam engine worked monotonously up and down like the head of an elephant in a stare of melancholy madness. D.H. Lawrence (1885 to 1930), British essayist and novelist, writing 70 years after Dickens, described the changes in a village in the coal belt, change which he had not experienced, but about which he had heard from the older people. Stood must have been a tiny village at the beginning of the 19th century, a small piece of cottage and fragmentary rows of a little four-roomed miners' dwelling, the homes of the old coilers, but somewhere about 1820s the company must have sunk the first big shaft and installed the first machinery of the real industrial colliery. Most of the little rows of dwellings were pulled down and dull little shops began to rise along the Nottingham Road, while on the downslope the company erected what is still known as the new buildings, little four-room house looking outward into the grim, blank street, and the back looking into the desert of the square, shut in like a barracks enclosure. Very strange. Activity 3 discussed the effects of early industrialization on British towns and villages and compared this with similar situations in India. Comment this. Protest movements. The early decades of industrialization coincide with the spread of the new political ideas pioneered by the French Revolution 1789 to 94. The movements of liberty, equality, and fraternity showed the possibilities of collective mass action both in creating democratic institutions like the French parliamentary assemblies of the 1790s and in checking the worst hardship of war by controlling the prices of necessities like bread in England. Political protest against the harsh working conditions in factories kept increasing, and the working population agitated to be given the right to vote. The government reacted by repressions and by new laws that denied people the right to protest. England had been at war with France for a long time, from 1792 to 1815. Trade between England and Europe was disrupted, factories were forced to shut down, unemployment grew, and the price of essential items of food like bread and meat showed to heights beyond the level of average wages. Parliament in 1795 passed two Combination Act which made it illegal to incite the people by speech or writing to hatred or contempt of the king, constitution of or government, and banned unauthorized public meetings of Over 50% protest nonetheless continued against old corruption. This term was used for privileges linked to the monarchy and parliament. Members of parliament, landowners, manufacturers, and professionals were opposed to giving the working population the right to vote. They supported the Corn Laws, which prevented the import of cheaper food until prices in Britain had risen to a certain level. As workers flooded towns and factories, they expressed their anger and frustration in numerous forms of protest. There were bread or food riots throughout the country from the 1790s onward. Bread was a staple item in the diet of the poor, and its price governed their standard of living. Stocks of bread were seized and sold at a price that was affordable and morally correct rather than at the high prices charged by profit-hungry traders. Such riots were particularly frequent in the worst year of the war, 1795, but they continued until the 1840s. Another cause of hardship was the process known as enclosure, by which from the 1770s hundreds of small farms had been merged into the larger ones of powerful landlords. Poor rural families affected by this had short industrial work, but the introduction of machines in the cotton industry threw thousands of handloom weavers out of work and into poverty, since their labor was too slow to compete with machines. From the 1790s, these weavers began to demand a legal minimum wages, which was refused by Parliament. When they went on strike, they were dispersed by force. In dispersion in Lancashire, cotton weavers destroyed the power looms, which they believed had destroyed their livelihoods. There was also resistance to the introduction of the machines in the woolen knitting industry in Nottingham. Protests also took place in Leicestershire and Derbyshire. In Warwickshire, shearing frame were destroyed by croppers who had traditionally sheared shipped by hand. In the riots of 1830, farm laborers found their jobs threatened by the new threshing machines that, that separated the grain from the husk. The rioters smashed these machines, 9 of them were hanged, and 450 were sent to Australia as convicts. The theme, the movement known as Luddism, 1811 to 17, led by the charismatic General Ned Ludd, amplified another type of protest. Luddism was not merely a backward-looking assault on machines. Its participants demanded a minimum wage, control over the labor of women and children, work for those who had lost their jobs because of the coming of machinery, and the right to form trade unions so that they could legally present these demands. During the early years of industrialization, the working population possessed neither the vote nor legal methods to express their anger at the drastic manner in which their lives had been overturned. In August 1819, 80,000 people gathered peacefully at St. Peter's Fields in Manchester to claim democratic rights of political organizations, of public meeting, and of a freedom of the press. They were suppressed brutally in what became known as the Peterloo massacre, and the rights they demanded were denied by the Six Acts passed by Parliament the same year. This extended the restriction on political activity introduced in the two combination Acts of 1795, but there were some gains after Peterloo. The need to make the House of Commons more representative was recognized by liberal political groups, and the Combination Act was repealed in 1824 to 25. This name was made up to rhyme with Waterloo. The French army had been defeated at Waterloo in 1815. Reforms through laws. How attentive was the government to the condition of work of women and children? Laws were passed in 1819 prohibiting the employment of children under the age of 9 in factories and limiting the hours of work of those between the ages of 9 and 16 to 12 hours a day. While this law lacked the powers needed for its enforcement, it was not until 1833, after intense protest by workers throughout the north of England, that an act was passed that permitted children under 9 to be employed only in silk factories, limited the hours of work for older children, and provided a number of factory inspectors to ensure that the act was enforced. Finally, in 1847, after more than 30 years of agitations, the 10 hours bill was passed. This limited the hours of work for women and young people and secured a 10-hour day for male workers. These acts apply to the textile industries but not to the mining industries. The Mine Commission of 1842, set up by the government, revealed that working conditions in mines had actually become worse since the Act of 1833 because more children had been put to work in coal mines. The Mines and Collieries Act of 1842 banned children under 10 and women from working underground. Fielder's Factory Act laid down in 1847 that children under 18 and women should not work more than 10 hours a day. These laws were to be enforced by factory inspector, but this was difficult to do. The inspectors were poorly paid and easily bribed by factory managers, while parents lied about the real ages of their children so that they could work and contribute to family incomes. Activity 4 argue the case for the against government regulation of conditions of work in industries. Comment this. The debate on the industrial revolutions. Until the 1970s, historians used the term industrial revolutions for the changes that occurred in Britain from the 1780s to the 1820s. From then it was challenged on various grounds. Industrialization had actually been too gradual to be considered a revolution. It carried processes that already existed towards new levels. Thus, there was a relatively greater concentration of workers in factories and a wider use of money. Until into the 19th century, large regions of England remained untouched by factories or mines, and therefore the term industrial revolution was regarded as inaccurate. England had changed in a regional manner, prominently around the cities of London, Manchester, Birmingham, or Newcastle rather than throughout the country. Could the growth in the cotton or iron industries or in foreign trade from the 1780s to the 1820s be called revolutionary? The impressive growth of cotton textile based on new machinery was in an industry that relied on a non-British raw material on self-aboard, especially India, on non-metallic machinery, and with feelings to other branches of industry. Metallic machinery and steam power was rare until much later in the 19th century. The rapid growth in British imports and exports from the 1780s occurred because the resumption of trade with North America that the War of American Independence had interrupted. This growth was recorded as being sharp only because it started from a low point. Indicators of economic change occurring before and after 1815 to 20 suggest that sustained industrialization was to be seen after rather than before these dates. The decades after 1793 had experienced the disruptive effect of the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. Industrialization is associated with the growing investment of the country, wealth and capital formation, or building infrastructure and installing new machinery, and with raising the levels of efficient use of these facilities, and with raising productivity. Productive investment in this sense grew steadily. Only after 1820s and did level of productivity, the cotton, iron and engineered industries had accounted for less than half of the industrial output until the 1840s. Technical progress was not limited to this branches but was visible in other branches too, like agricultural processing and pottery. In searching for an answer as to why British growth may have been faster after 1815 than before, historians have pointed to the fact that from the 1760s to 1815, Britain tried to do to think simultaneously, to industrialize and to fight wars in Europe, North America, and India, and it may possibly have failed with one. Britain was at war for 36 out of 60 years from 1760. Capital that was borrowed was used to fight the wars rather than invested. As much as 35% of the cost of the war was made by taxing people's income. Workers were transferred out of factories and farms to the army. Food prices rose so sharply that the poor had little money left for buying consumer goods. Napoleon's policies of blockade, the British reaction to them, closed the European continent, the destination for more than half of British exports to British traders. The word industrial used with the word revolution is too limited. The transformation extended beyond the economic or industrial sphere and into society and gave prominence to two classes, the bourgeoisie and the new classes of proletarian laborers in towns and in the countryside. In 1851, visitors thronged the Great Exhibition at the specially constructed Six Crystal Palace in London to view the achievement of British industry at the time. Half of the population was living in town, but of the workers in towns, as many were in handicraft units as in factories. From in 1850s, the proportion of people living in urban areas went up dramatically, and most of these were workers in industry. The working classes, only 20% of Britain workforce now lived in rural areas. This was a far more rapid rate of industrialization than had been witnessed in other European countries. In his detailed study of British industry, the historian A. E. Mason has suggested that the Great Exhibition in 1851 displays the works of industry of all nations, particularly the spectacular progress of Britain. It was held in London's Hyde Park in the Crystal Palace, made of glass pans set in iron columns manufactured in Birmingham. There were good grounds for regarding the period 1850 to 1940 as that in which the Industrial Revolution really occurred on a massive scale, transforming the whole economy and society much more widely and deeply than the earlier changes had done. Exercises, answer in brief, answer in a short essay. Comment this.